thanks everyone for inviting me here and doing me this honor. We've had various links with Bourneau going back to the 1990s, and may that long continue. Now, when I was first asked to give the title for this talk, it was 2019, because I was originally going to give the talk in March 2020, but events intervened. So I've taken the talk I would have given then about my perspective on security engineering, sustainability, and the update cycle, and updated it with what we've learned in the 2 years since. And so this particular part of the story goes back to 2015, when the European Union, of which Britain was then still an enthusiastic member, asked Aaron Leverett, Richard Clayton, and me to examine what the Internet of Things implied for the regulation of safety, because Brussels has over 20 sector-specific agencies that regulate the safety of cars, railway signals, children's toys, medical devices, aircraft, and so on and so forth. And what happens once you get software and everything? Are there any general lessons that have to be learned? Are there any institutional changes that are needed? And so we produced a report for them in 2016 on that came out in public in 2017. And one of the main things that we found was that once there's software everywhere, safety and security get entangled. And in fact, the two are the same in most EU languages: Sicurezza, Seguridad, Sûreté, Sicherheit. And they're still not quite the same thing. But the big question is, how would you update safety regulation and safety regulators to cope with the fact that they now have to start thinking about security, about hostile action potentially over a network, as well as merely the safety policies of the devices that are sold in different sectors? Now, we looked specifically at three verticals. We looked at cars, we looked at medical devices, and we looked at electricity substations, because these were things about which we understood something. And it's well known that markets do safety in some industries, such as aviation, way better than others, such as medicine, right? Because when planes crash, it's a front page news, hundreds of people die at a time. You can't just lie your way out of it. Whereas if a medical device fails, then maybe that person was very sick already and it just isn't noticed. As for cars, it is notorious that cars were really unsafe until the 1960s. To begin with, car makers just put on more chromium and roomier engines. They didn't worry about seatbelts and things like that, until Ralph Nader published a book, Unsafe at Any Speed. And this led to the US government setting up the National Highways Transportation Safety Administration, or NHTSA, which started to take care about car safety. And in the EU, there's been a similar history. We've got frameworks like Product Liability Directive for all goods, and directives and type approval for cars, and a whole lot of detailed rules. Now, the whole safety engineering universe is very complex, with a number of different EU and some UN agencies in play. So how does the world change once you start having online access to cars? Well, cars get hacked. The first academic paper on this was Yoshi Kono and Damon McCoy and others' paper on Car Shark in 2011, where they showed that you could take over a car if you had temporary access to it through the temporary physical access to it. And you could then remotely command the brakes, the accelerator, the doors, and so on. But this didn't get any widespread traction because the attack seemed a little bit difficult to do. Then in 2015, there was suddenly a media sensation when two former NSA guys, Charlie Miller and Chris Valashek, hacked a Jeep Cherokee over the radio. All Jeep Cherokees came with a service in America called Uconnect, which was basically a private network on Sprint. And this was extremely insecure. You could guess the IP addresses of cars and then go and look and see where they were. And so by looking at lots of cars, you could eventually find the car that you wanted to target. So what Charlie and Chris did was to target a car in which a volunteer journalist was driving and slow it down to 20 miles an hour on the freeway so that the trucks were hooting behind it, and then use the auto park feature to drive it off the motorway onto the verge. And this got on TV, it became front page news, and all of a sudden Chrysler ended up having to spend over $1 billion recalling 1.4 million vehicles for a software fix. So all of a sudden, hacking over the air is a really big deal. Now here's another character. I wonder if anybody recognizes this gentleman on the left here. He was for a while the CEO of a famous car factory in Czechia, as well as in car factories in Germany and even in Britain. This is Martin Winterkorn, the CEO of Volkswagen, now facing criminal prosecution, and his chairman has actually had a criminal conviction. Because what Winterkorn and his friends did was to monkey with the emission standards. They programmed Volkswagen cars so that the car would detect if it was doing an emissions test, and if so, it would make nice with its emissions. When it was no longer being tested, it would crank up the power and spit out an awful lot more nitrogen dioxide. And it wasn't just Volkswagen that was doing it, they're all doing it, right? All the car makers are now facing big lawsuits. So the lesson from here is that the enemy isn't just the wicked hacker sitting in his basement in St. Petersburg. The enemy can be the CEO of the company from whom you're buying an expensive product. Now, medical devices. If you get in a car that's unsafe and you have a crash, then you might end up here. This is the intensive care unit at the hospital in Swansea. How many programmable devices do you see here with user interfaces? Hint. You see, intensive care is just as complicated as a car, right? But the systems integration hasn't been done by the vendor. It's basically done by the nurses. They hook all this stuff up, and then they run from one device to another, reading data from this device and putting commands into the next device. So I wonder what goes wrong here. Well, here are the infusion pumps photographed by my colleague Harold Thimbleby in Swansea's intensive care unit. And you can see all the user interfaces are different. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is 7, 8, 9, 4, 5, 6, right? This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then along the bottom. And if you even look at these two devices, these are both called the Bodyguard 545. And yet for one of them to increase the dose of medicine, you press 2, and to decrease, you press 0. And in the other, to increase the dose of medicine, you press 5, and to decrease it, you press 0. And these are all devices in use at the same time in the same hospital ward. So guess what happens? You get fatal accidents. And Harold's research showed that safety usability failures in the UK kill about the same number of people as road traffic accidents. In a country the size of the UK, that's a couple of thousand per annum. In a country the size of Czechia, that's maybe 400 per annum. And nobody pays much attention to these because the accidents happen one at a time. And for each individual hospital, this may be about the number 40 or number 50 cause of death. So it doesn't get any attention from the management. Safety usability is ignored because each of the vendors wants to keep on doing its own thing. The regulators don't have the power to tell the vendors, you will in future all use this interface. And how could you fix this? Well, in aviation, it's fixed by requiring that a pilot certify on every type of aircraft before they fly it. So if someone wants to move from a Boeing 737 to an Airbus 321, they've got to go and pass an exam, read the book, sit in the simulator, pass a check ride, and this costs thousands of bucks. So there is an incentive for the airlines to see to it that all their different models have exactly the same cockpit. This incentive is failing in the case of medical devices. But along comes security, and attacks are harder to ignore. Now, everybody knew for years that medical devices are unsafe. And Kevin Fu of the University of Michigan showed back in 2015 that he could hack over Wi-Fi into a Hospira brand of infusion pump and thereby get into the hospital network. And this was sufficiently scary that the Food and Drugs Administration, the regulator in the USA, banned that particular type of pump. It didn't ban the 200 other unsafe types of pump in America because that would have been too traumatic for the industry. But thankfully, after Biden got elected president, Kevin Fu got an assistant chief technical officer job at the FDA, so something is starting to happen there. Now, medical device recalls are now getting expensive because in 2017, there was a recall of 450,000 pacemakers made by a company called St. Jude. And the public was sensitive to that because there had been a movie in which the vice president of the USA was killed by the Russians tampering with his pacemaker, right? But changing a pacemaker is expensive because it involves surgery. The pacemaker is put in the muscle behind your shoulder blade, and if they're going to take that out and change the battery, they have to have a cardiologist there in case you get a heart attack, and it's a day surgery procedure, and it might cost 2,000 or 3,000 euros. So changing 500,000 pacemakers costs you billions of euros or dollars or whatever. This is a big deal. So one of the things that we were asked is, what should Europe do? And since last year, Europe has updated the Medical Devices Directive to require post-market surveillance, per-risk device management, ergonomic design. And here's one of the regulations. For devices that incorporate software, the software shall be developed in accordance with the state-of-the-art, taking into account the principles of development life cycle, risk management, including information security, verification, and validation. This is a big change, and devices shall be designed and manufactured in such a way as to protect, as far as possible, against unauthorized access that could hamper the device from functioning as intended. It's still not perfect, but it's a great improvement, and it's one example of, how the European Commission has been making things a bit better. Now, the third thing that we looked at was industrial control systems, and I'd had a research student 10, 12 years ago who was sponsored by ABB and was looking at electricity substations. And there you've got a different kind of problem, because with an electricity substation, you have a 40-year life cycle. You've got protocols that don't support authentication, and you've got very strong standards. Everybody wants to be able to interwork with everybody else's components. And what went wrong is that in the early 1990s, IP networking arrived, and it was so much cheaper than using dedicated leased lines that suddenly everybody put everything on an IP network. And that meant that anybody who knows a sensor's IP address can read from it, and anybody who knows an actuator's IP address can activate it. And what we found was that the only sensible fix was to reperimeterize. And the companies that set out to do that, like Belden, ended up making a lot of money. For example, BP, Britain's big oil company, now has about 5,000 of their firewalls around all sorts of little oil and gas and chemical plants worldwide. Because if you have got half a dozen pieces of equipment sitting in a little fenced-off area somewhere, then there's typically one point there where there's network connectivity to the network control center, and so there's a convenient place where you can put your firewall. And if you replace that every 5 years, you're probably good. Doing that with cards is harder because a car may have 10 different radio interfaces to the world, and the integration is kind of different. The other sort of problem we discovered there is that once people start putting in smart meters, you may have a remotely controlled off switch in your house. And Britain had a big project for smart meters. Many countries in Europe did. Germany decided not to. Other countries like Spain had smart meters that communicated on the power line to the substation. I don't know what you have in Czechia. But the problem is if you've got smart meters that communicate over ordinary IP networks to a control center, is it possible for the Russians to turn them off? Right, because if you could get hold of the master key and you could switch off all the electricity meters in a country you don't like, well, that's the cyber war equivalent of a nuclear strike. That is, really big stuff. Anyway, From this survey, the kind of questions that get raised are, firstly, who's going to investigate incidents and to whom will they be reported? Do you report only to the police if there's a car crash, or to the insurers? If you suspect there's electronics involved, do you have to report to ENISA? Do you have to report to the software vendor, to CERT? How's that going to work? And how do you embed responsible disclosure? Volkswagen actually sued the University of Birmingham in England and the University of Nijmegen in Holland after researchers there discovered a flaw in the remote key entry system. Despite the fact they did responsible disclosure, Volkswagen panicked at the last minute and sent out lawyers' letters. They lost, incidentally. They lost the court case. But it was a scary thing. Then the next thing is, how do you bring safety engineers and security engineers together? We have different cultures. We talk different languages. We went on different degree courses, go to different conferences. And also, the safety engineering profession is fragmented. The people who do it for cars and the people who do it for railway signals and the people who do it for aircraft don't talk much to each other. Will the regulators all need security engineers? Are all these 20-plus agencies in Brussels going to have to hire one of your grad students? And if so, is there going to be enough work to stop him getting completely bored? And then how do you prevent abuse of lock-in? Because technology is plagued by all sorts of monopolies, and very often security is used as an excuse for this. In Britain, for example, the railway industry persuaded the government to make all railway signals stuff classified, not because it's that relevant to national security, but just because they wanted to minimize the number of companies who could tender for the work, and thereby push up the prices. And of course, the security agencies don't have any incentive to declassify it, because that diminishes their power and their span of control. So the kind of recommendations that we come up with included, firstly, requiring vendors to certify that products can be patched if need be. On the day that I presented these results to about 100 people in Brussels in October 2016, that was when the Mirai botnet made its first appearance. And I was on the Eurostar going back to London, reading about how nobody in the eastern seaboard of the USA could access Twitter. And we later started tracking the Mirai botnet. But we definitely got the requirement to patch in there and high up. And coming with that, you need a secure development lifecycle with vulnerability management for anything that's likely to be close to systemic. Then we recommended a cybersecurity advice body for European safety regulators and a duty to report breaches and vulnerabilities to safety regulators and users, rather than just as at present to ENISA. And we also recommended extending product liability to services, about which nothing has been done because of noisy lobbying by the IT industry and others. But here's the punchline. After we delivered the report, we went away to Schloss Dargstuhl, and we were in a seminar and we were thinking about this sort of stuff. And we said, well, what did we really learn out of this exercise? And it just occurred to us, there's this, that at present we know how to make two types of secure device. The first is things like your phone or your laptop, which is secure because you patch it every month, right? But you make them obsolete quickly because Larry and Sergey don't have enough money to patch 3-year-old Android. Hey, you don't want to support 100 different models. And then you've got things like cars and medical devices, where the strategy is to test them to death before release, but don't connect them to the internet, and you almost never patch them, unless you've got something like the Jeep Cherokee incident. And patching is expensive if you have to reflash stuff. Okay, so what's going to happen to support costs now that we're starting to connect all sorts of durable goods to the internet? Because that means you're going to have to patch them, doesn't it? If you get a remotely exploitable vulnerability that would enable the Russians to turn every C-class Mercedes in Western Europe into a brick, then Mercedes has got to patch that, don't they? And if you have to patch 20 different models of car for 10 years after the last car leaves the showroom, how much is that going to cost you? The answer is lots. And this certainly got the attention of the car industry and others. So here, if you like, is the trilemma. If you get a standard safety life cycle with no patching, then you get safety and sustainability, but if you go online, you get hacked. If you have the standard security life cycle, then you get patching, but that breaks safety certification. If you've got to take your device and put it through qualification as a car or as an airplane or as a railway signal, that can be a painful process. Because if you redo safety certification with current methods, it can be very, very expensive. With a car, for example, you typically have what's called a lab car, which is a big rack of equipment with an instance of every piece of electronics in the car. And you've got equipment which will generate suitable journeys. You can press a button to generate a 40-kilometer right offset crash, for example, or a journey from Hamburg to Bremen or whatever, and you can then see what the electronics does in response to that. But these machines are produced by a monopolist, and so they cost hundreds of thousands of euros, and so the car vendors want to repurpose them as soon as possible. Also, if you're going to requalify software, you've got to keep instances of the old cars so that you can do test driving. And you've got to keep engineers who remember how it all worked. And the car industry tends to not offer career structures to programmers, so most of their programmers leave after 4 or 5 years. Right? So it's really, really difficult. There are also long supply chains with lots of the interesting stuff being done at the second or third tier. So here's the economics. Over the last 40 years, vehicle lifetimes have about doubled, and in the UK, cars now last for about 15 years. And when we came out with this work 5 years ago, big car makers in Germany were saying, well, we don't want to maintain software for more than 6 years, because if you go to Mercedes to buy a car, they look at your shoes, and if you have nice shiny shoes, they try and sell you a new car, and if you've got old scuffed shoes, they try and sell you a Mercedes-approved used car. But if you're driving a 10-year-old Mercedes, they say, well, he's a sucker, we just sell him spare parts. But is this good enough? If the safety of your car now depends on software upgrades, and perhaps you need software upgrades to pass an annual roadworthiness check, then without software upgrades, your car is useless. Now, here's another thing. The embedded CO2 cost of a car often exceeds its lifetime fuel burn, especially if you buy a fancy car. Right? So usually the most economical car is the car you already own. And if you suddenly cut the lifetime of a car from 15 years to 6 years, the environmental costs are unacceptable. And then what about Africa, where most vehicles are imported second-hand? So there is, of course, a cartoon. My engine's making a weird noise. Can you take a look? Sure, just pop the hood. Oh, the hood latch is also broken. Okay, just pull up to that big pit and push the car, and we'll go get a new one. Right, that's what the world looks like if you start treating cars the way we treat computers. It's not going to work. So we have to start thinking about the economics of dependability. And this is something that we've been doing in the security context for 20-odd years now. Complex socio-technical systems often fail because of poor incentives. If Alice guards the system but Bob pays the cost of failure, you can expect trouble. And security economics explains platform security problems, the patching cycle, liability games, and a lot of other things that we used to treat as bad luck or bad weather. And the same principles apply in large part to safety, and they become ever more important as safety and security become entangled. Okay? So this becomes a more complex problem than just a technical one, but we do have some of the tools to think about this and theorize it, and we do have some idea when we go out and collect data from the real world, what sort of data we should collect and how we should analyze it. So the European Commission sat on this for a while, and they made a couple of attempts to mandate software patching, which didn't work. They were blocked by various lobbyists. And then finally, they got it through in Directive 771 of 2019, which was an update on the sales of goods. And it says that buyers of goods with digital elements are entitled to necessary updates for 2 years, or for longer if this is a reasonable expectation of the customer. And the reason for this language is that goods with digital elements can mean things that have got software in them, an electronic watch, or anything that requires an app to work, like your Tesla, or anything that requires a server to work as well, like your Tesla, right? So a Tesla is goods with digital elements under all 3 headings. But what's a reasonable expectation of the customer? This is the thing that snuck this through, because we already have other laws in the EU saying that consumer durables in general must be serviced for 10 years. You must make spare parts available for washing machines, for TVs, for cars, and so on and so forth. And so what this will tend to mean in practice is that if you're selling software to a car vendor, you need 20 years service, because there's 3 years while the car is still in R&D, then there's 7 years when it's actively on sale, and then 10 years after the last car leaves the showroom. And it may very well be that in future that 10 years will be extended, particularly if software updates become mandatory for car safety tests. Domestic appliances, medical devices, the same kind of thing applies. And electricity substations, I already mentioned, there's like a 40-year requirement there. So this is the grand challenge for research as we were talking about it like 3 years ago. If the durable goods we're designing today are still working in 2060, then things have to change. And the opportunity for computer scientists is that our trade is about managing complexity. And all through the last, 60 years of computer science, we came up, first of all, with high-level languages like Fortran and COBOL, and then you had types and things like Pascal, and then you had objects, and then you had tools like Git and Jenkins and Coverity, which enable us to run bigger projects and to manage greater complexity. And so what we have to start asking now is what else will be needed for sustainable computing once we get software in just about everything. And so since about 2016 and 17, I've been teaching safety and security engineering in the same course to first-year undergrads. And thanks to the pandemic, you can now get all these lectures online. I had to record them in a hell of a hurry in March 2020, when I was actually supposed to be coming here for my visit before the pandemic delayed it. And we've also been starting to look at what we can do to make the tool chain more sustainable. The first thing we looked at is whether you could stop compiler writers from opening up timing channels. Because as you know, every year or so, somebody comes up with some compiler trick which optimizes away the routines, the extra instructions, in cryptographic toolkits like OpenSSL. So suddenly there's a timing channel, and then Adam Laurie has to get out of bed and figure out how to fix it and ship a patch. Is there some way that you could communicate to the compiler an intent saying, I want this particular routine to be executed in constant time, or I want these variables to be zeroized when the subroutine returns? So we had a paper called What You Get is What You See, was our first attempt at doing some work in this field. And over the last couple of years, we've been looking closely at machine learning, because our sustainability work led to sponsorship from Bosch to look at machine vision. Now, Robert Bosch was the guy who in 1898 invented the spark plug, and it's now one of the big tier 1 car parts makers. And they've got about 100,000 engineers, about half of whom work on cars. And they have a huge center in Berlin that's working on machine vision for autonomous vehicles. Now, ever since 10 years ago, when a couple of teams showed that you could use deep neural networks to do vision recognition much better than previous techniques, everybody's using deep neural networks for machine vision. But these are very vulnerable to adversarial examples, as we'll see in the next slide. And people started to become really worried that somebody might be able to crash a car by using a data projector to shine some evil pattern onto a motorway bridge. Should you actually worry about this? Well, maybe not, because If I want to kill somebody in a car that's going under a motorway bridge where I can put my agent, I can just stand on the bridge and shoot him or drop a brick on him. So maybe it's not a thing you should worry about. But if it is a thing you worry about, then maybe the right response might be to try to make machine vision systems fragile rather than robust, so that you know that you're being attacked, so that you get an alarm whenever anybody does something weird. And so the question we set out to look at first is, how might we do that? Now, this is the basic idea with adversarial inputs, that you take an image, and the image on the left is from one of the stock images that people use for these tests. It's an image of a bird. And then there's a difference, a very faint signal, which I've amplified here as much as possible to make it visible, but it's actually an invisible signal because you end up with the image on the right, and that gets misclassified as an automobile. So you can turn a picture from a bird into a car with a few tiny tweaks. And we now know that adversarial examples exist for all deep neural network models because of the nature of the beast, because you've got a high-dimensional model with very, very convoluted decision boundaries. And you can find attacks using gradient descent methods, and very often these attacks are transferable. So how would you go about detecting attacks? Well, if you've got a class cat and a class dog, people have been previously looking at the adversarial samples, things that are very close to the class cat, which you can get misclassified as dog or vice versa. But when you step back and look at this, there's a very much larger decision space. And there are some things in there that you should never see in the real world, like class morphs and Pokemons and so on. And if your Mercedes is driving down the Autobahn and you see a Pokemon in front of you, then that should definitely raise an alarm because you're in the wrong quantum universe. This leads us to think that there should be a different way of dealing with adversarial inputs. And so here's the idea that we come up with. The idea is we call the taboo trap. And here's the insight. That if you have kids, you train your kids to have beautiful manners and they speak very politely and they're very well behaved and so on. But at age 5 or so, they go off to school. And by Friday, they know some words that your mother doesn't like. So you know that they have been exposed to some adversarial samples because they break taboos. So the idea we had is, can you set taboos, whether on outputs or on intermediate activations, during training, and then alarm when you see them? So you retrain your device so that it will never say, I see a Pokemon, and if it says, I see a Pokemon, you know it's been got at, right? Take that model out and shoot it. And the answer is that this works rather well, and you can diversify it with different taboos, just like crypto keys. So you can see to it that not every car that Volkswagen makes has got exactly the same sensitivities. So this was just the beginning, but here's the interesting bit. The next thing that we looked at is what we call sponge attacks. Is it possible to use the techniques of adversarial sample manufacture to come up with samples that don't just give the wrong answer, but which cause the neural network model, the machine learning model, to take a long time or to take an awful lot of energy, right? So that you could perhaps deplete the battery of the device that looks at this particular thing. And the answer is yes. There's all sorts of ways in which you can slow down neural network models because they're usually highly optimized on assumptions of sparsity. And when you start doing this in practice against a wide range of machine learning systems, you find that you can slow down machine vision systems a bit, maybe 20% or so, but where you can really get a result is more complex systems like natural language processing systems. If you throw something with a double meaning at a natural language processing system, it may oscillate between the two possibilities. And what we found entirely by random chance, by throwing lots of stuff at the system and measuring the result, is that if we dropped 3 Chinese characters into a Russian text and then fed that into Google Translate, it took 5,000 times as long. Presumably because it has to break out of the Russian to English translation machine and phone up the data center in Hong Kong and say, hey, Henry, you got any idea what's going on here? So, you know, where you have got branching logic in your machine learning model, and you can activate that and put things onto a slow path, you can really get a different outcome. So this tells us that machine learning systems have to be designed for worst case rather than average case, or else you have to place limits on computation. You have to tell your model, you're allowed to use so many cycles to try and recognize this, and otherwise this other thing will happen. Now, one of the things that we realized when we started discussing this is that although real system engineers had known this stuff for decades, all the youngsters have gone very enthusiastically into machine learning, have never come across this, and they don't stop to think about it. So, hey, how do you get the message across? Well, here's something that came off of that work, which is independently interesting because it brings me back to my original theme of how do you go about managing the patching of software. So a new research student, Nicolas Boucher, was inspired by the discovery that Chinese characters would hose a Russian to English translation. And he started looking at various ways in which you could attack NLP systems by messing around with the coding. Now, when spam became a big deal in the late 1990s and then phishing became a big deal around about 2005, various bad guys used various tricks to try and disguise emails, pad out emails. The standard Bayesian classifiers wouldn't recognize them. You know, you put bad characters into an email, or you use misspellings or whatever. And people play Unicode games in the early days of phishing to obscure URLs. You know, that you, instead of trying to have Barclays.com with a Q, you might try it with a Cyrillic A instead of a Latin A. And we evolved mechanisms about 15 years ago to deal with that. So we asked what sort of games can be played with machine translation systems. And it turns out that you can play plenty games with machine translation systems, even using the simple techniques from 15 years ago, phishing and malware tricks. Because when we started testing this last year, none of the big NLP systems looked out for this. So the sort of thing that you could do was use homoglyphs. The normal A and the Cyrillic A render as exactly the same glyph, same bit pattern, but they're entirely different Unicode code points. And so you can sabotage translation by swapping a handful of characters for homoglyphs. So if you, one of the students who worked in this, Ilya Shumailov, was Russian, and his partner's Ukrainian, but that's another story. And if he wanted to say something in Russian on Facebook without Facebook auto-translating it, he could simply drop in a few Latin A's into the Cyrillic, and this would make Facebook blind and deaf to what was being said. And so Nicolas started experimenting and looking at the whole Unicode character set, and found that you can often get a similar effect by dropping in a few zero-width spaces. And Unicode has these for various technical and obscure reasons to do with how you render funny languages like Arabic, but they're there and you can just bung them in. You can bung in 10 or 20 zero-width spaces between two letters in your name so that you end up getting dozens of different variants of your name that will be found differently by different search engines. And we find that this sabotage is not just translation, but also toxic content filtering. Because if you go online to your favorite social medium, Twitter or whatever, and then you say rude things, you may find that your post gets blocked. And that's because the social media tend to use specialist contractors or particular pieces of NLP software to look out for toxic content. And you can defeat this fairly trivially by using these kinds of coding tricks. And that's kind of scary. Because, for example, as is well known, Facebook was exploited by the government of Burma, Myanmar, when they decided to have a pogrom against the Rohingya minority. And the people who were in a position to speak up about that and push back on it, people like the New York Times, for example, didn't actually employ anybody who could speak Burma, right? They were relying on machine translation systems. And so if you wanted to issue a call to violence, come all faithful citizens and kill the Muslim horrible people, you could see to it that this would not be picked up by the machine translation systems by very simple poisoning techniques. So you would think that it would be a sensible thing to do if you're providing machine translation systems as a service on which hundreds of other companies are depending, that you should actually check the input before you put it into your system. And what we found when we did disclosure of this to the various NLP companies is that they weren't interested, right? The NLP people said, we're sorry, this isn't an NLP problem. This is really annoying. This is a security problem. Go and talk to the security people. We do machine learning models here. We don't do security. And the security people would say, you mean these idiots were just taking any crap from the internet and throwing it straight into their machine without checking it? That's not security. That's just stupidity. Right? And so the whole thing would fall entirely between the cracks. Nobody in any of these companies was responsible for doing anything about it. And it gets worse. Many years ago, 40-odd years ago, I worked for a short while on a project doing multilingual typesetting, and we had fun trying to typeset left to right and right to left languages in the same paragraph. Say you've got a newspaper in Arabic or Hebrew, and you want to quote a phrase in it in English, and the Arabic or Hebrew goes right to left, and then you've got the English going left to right, and you've got to fiddle around to try and justify it and make it look normal to users of both languages. And that's really, really difficult. And so Unicode has got directionality control characters which let you swap define blocks of characters and then swap the rendering from right to left or from left to right. And you can nest these, which means that you can do essentially arbitrary permutations on blocks of characters using Unicode characters which are not rendered by normal rendering engines. And so what we discovered is that we can write an email in English saying, please pay $1,000 to account number 1223, and Google Translate will turn it into Spanish as, please pay $1,000 to account 321. And you would think that companies like Microsoft and Google and IBM would know to sanitize all inputs, right? Because they have been attacked in all sorts of ways, SQL injection, buffer overflows, been going on for decades and decades and decades. But no, it was not being done, and most of them still aren't doing it. Now, here's the next evolution. We then discovered that tricks such as homoglyphs and bidirectional control characters apply to source code too. Because if you embed bidirectionality control characters in source code, then you can get away with this unless it's a very, very ancient computer language, like Fortran 4, or a very, very ancient editor like Vim, which just ignores all this stuff. Then the compilers will ignore bidirectionality control characters if they're in comments or in string literals. And this means that you can smuggle these control characters into source code with the result that the compilers use one logic and the human reviewer another. And here's an example at the bottom here, which I suppose many of you are probably at too great a distance to see, but basically the idea is that you can move a command inside or outside of a comment, so that from the point of view of the human reviewer, the code is obviously going to output you're not an admin, and however it ends up outputting you are an admin because the relevant bit was moved outside of a comment. And there are various other ways in which you can do it. This is just one example of many possibilities. Now, it turns out that this bug affects essentially all modern computer languages except Haskell. And it was undetectable on essentially all modern editors and repository front ends. Right? So we had an interesting time doing responsible disclosure, which we did late last year, August, September last year. And after a fair hassle, we managed to get CVEs, one CVE for bidirectionality control characters and another for homoglyphs. And eventually, after a fair bit of struggle about which we'll have a paper forthcoming, many fixed it. So this is, for example, what we're seeing in GitHub. If you start putting this kind of funny business into code, and then you've got a warning coming up, and you've got the bidirectionality control characters. They're actually rendered visibly as Unicode control points. And of course, the thing that you're most worried about here is that somebody who is malicious may contribute code to an open source project on which many people rely. And we came across some years ago of a malicious third party trying to smuggle some bad code into WebKit, which is used in Safari and other browsers and would have enabled them to make several $1 million by selling a 0-day to the exploit brokers. So this actually matters, that the front ends that people use will alarm on this, and an increasing number of computer languages are changing their specification or their implementation so that they throw compiler error warnings, or they have a linter that fixes it or whatever. We learned a lot about the culture of different computer languages from doing this. Rust was the keenest. As soon as we shipped the disclosure, they were all over us, and they were testing it this way and that, and had all sorts of intelligent suggestions. And they gave us access to their repositories of public code so that we could go through and check to see whether anybody had used such a trick in the past, and nobody had. Oracle, on the other hand, which sort of pretends to maintain Java, simply refused. They said, this isn't a Java language problem, this is a problem of whichever editor people use to edit Java with, so we're not doing anything and we're closing the thing. Amazon said nothing and murmured some things that might have been thought as legal threats. Apple acknowledged the report and said nothing at all, and we have to check every so often to see if they tweaked their compiler. Microsoft and Google eventually fixed stuff, although in both cases, initially we didn't get through. When we reported it to Microsoft via their website, the website was broken, and so we had to contact somebody internally in Microsoft to fix the bug reporting website and also to accept the report. And when we reported it to Google, they said, we're not paying you a bug bounty because we know of this already. And so we contacted somebody internally in Google and said, well, in that case, how come JavaScript and Golang are both vulnerable to it? Or they said, let's think about that. We also found that a number of languages and developer communities use front-end subcontractors like HackerOne. And in those cases, we basically bounced and had to work to get past the front end, because the front ends are given very clearly defined scopes for the kind of bugs they can pay bounties on. And if you come up with something at all new, they're not going to be able to cope with it. Now, here's the telling thing, that where you use bidirectionality control characters to screw around with source code, you can eventually, in fact, in the course of 3 months, you can get most of the community to fix it. Right? There are still some editors that aren't fixed, and there's still some languages that aren't fixed. And if you can find a company that's relying on Java and using an unfixed editor, then maybe you can do this kind of attack on them. However, the firms relying on third-party NLP services for translation and hate speech detection and general user interface tasks are almost all vulnerable. Google's the only company that's done something, and they've done a bit, but not, in our view, anything like enough. So the NLP community, the machine learning community, is somehow really behind on dealing with coordinated disclosure, and indeed on their conceptions of what a vulnerability is and what sort of things require attention. So that brings us to some conclusions, or I'd say new directions. I'm increasingly convinced that maintenance will be ever more of the cost of systems as they get more complex and as they start to incorporate machine learning components that are put together in very empirical ways and whose real operation isn't often well understood. Now, of safety, security, and sustainability, firms will be tempted to choose any two. And this is going to give rise to all sorts of stresses, particularly as safety and security become entangled, leading to pressure on sustainability, which is going to mean inevitably that regulators, lawmakers, have to push back to ensure that code is patched for long enough that people aren't ripped off. And that will create big cost pressures, which will create incentives on companies to cheat in any way that they can. So over the next few years, there will be a call for a need for ideas to support patching software for something more like a 30-year lifetime than the 3 years that people think of at the moment. And there's a number of lessons that we can draw from things that we've looked at so far. Crypto teaches how complex this can be. You can write good crypto, and it keeps on being undermined by things that people do in your compilers. Cars teach, how do you go about sustaining all the test environments? How could you perhaps cut the cost of doing testing on multiple different versions of your software? Control systems teach, can small changes to the architecture limit what you have to patch? Could you somehow compartment your system so that a large chunk of it could sit behind a firewall or a well-controlled API, which is where you would put your effort? Android teaches, how do you motivate OEMs to patch products that they no longer sell? Right, that's the big way in which Android falls behind iPhone. Machine learning teaches, do you engineer safety, security in the machine learning model at the API or end-to-end? Coordinated disclosure teaches, how do you deal with heterogeneous ecosystems? If you've got a system that depends to some extent on code and to some extent on machine learning models, and to some extent is internal and to some extent is external depending on subcontractors, how are you going to manage that? And finally, what's the split between technology and policy? You know, what can we easily do, and where are we going to have to rely on the legislators to say, you must patch your cars for 10 years, otherwise we'll tax you to pieces. So that is, if you like, the landscape as I see it for the next generation of research and security engineering. And with that, I'll just put up my book, of which I produced a 3rd edition during the lockdown to stop myself dying of boredom. And I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
So thank you very much for the talk. I have a question regarding one approach that seems to be going forward in the Android ecosystem, where the Google is taking over for patching the core of the system. Like, it's not solving all the issues, but it seems that basically one entity decided to patch at least the core of the system for older phones as well. Do you think that this can go same way for cars?
Sorry, I didn't catch the question.
The question was, Google is trying to make the ecosystem so that they will be responsible for patching the core of Android system on phones.
Okay, so something like Chrome, where they always patch it whenever you power it up. And if you don't like it, that's too bad.
Yeah. And the question is, will this go forward for the cars, or can you imagine something like that will be going forward for cars?
Well, the usual routine with cars is that if a car has to be patched for safety reasons, then they just tell everybody to go to the garage and have their E² prom reflashed. You typically don't get much choice in the matter, and if you don't do it, you may invalidate your insurance.
But that's the situation right now, and let's say 5 years ago there was the situation with Android phones. But now the patches are shipped by the Google, not really by the OEM vendor for that phone.
Well, in something like a car, it's made complex by the fact that most of the interesting software isn't produced by Mercedes or Volkswagen, but by Bosch and Conti and ZF and all the other people in the supply chain. Right? Until very recently, the car OEMs didn't hire significant numbers of programmers, and nobody wanted to work there. For example, if you worked as a programmer at Mercedes, you had to wear a suit and tie to work. So if you were a software guy, you wanted to work in car software and live in Stuttgart, you would go and work at Bosch, where you could just wear normal clothes to work, right? And all of a sudden, the OEMs have realized with a terrible sinking feeling that if they don't offer career structures to programmers, they're going to be completely held at the mercy of their Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers. into whose software they've got no visibility at all. And if the software is going to be more and more of the value in the supply chain, then they'd better start producing some of it. So there's a huge tension there, and there's also a huge tension with people like Google and Apple who would like to own the infotainment system. But the car OEMs don't want that to happen because they would then see Google and Apple as running off with an awful lot of the added value. So this is going to be a tussle space, believe me. Mm-hmm. People will be fighting for control and market share and aftermarket revenues. And the risk then is, of course, that safety becomes a kind of secondary consideration.
And the related question is, I can go and install a different operating system with on existing phone, which is stripped of all the stuff I don't need. Do you think something like that will be possible for cars as well?
Nope. It's something you can only do to a phone if you're a real 10th Dan geek, right? And you're prepared to take an old Android phone and end up with a phone that only kind of sort of works. Now, if you're a PhD student and you're trying to do something fancy, like demonstrate that you can do a man-in-the-middle attack on contactless payments, then you may go down that route. But if you're a normal person, you don't already because it's too complicated, right? There's too much stuff in phones. There's too many chips. The baseband is locked down anyway. There's all sorts of stuff in there around the payment mechanisms, around the secure elements and all the rest of it that people have put a lot of effort stopping you get into. With cars, it's more complex still because if someone like Volkswagen or Mercedes or whoever goes and buys software from Tier 1 and Tier 2s, they don't get to see the source code, right? They get given a piece of object code and they get given a calling convention and there's an NDA saying you will not try and reverse engineer my code. This is from all the lawyers, right? Because if there is something like the emission scandal, then if you're Bosch, you don't want to end up in jail alongside Volkswagen. And this is just how the car industry has done things for 100 years, so it's very, very difficult to change and establish business practice. Now, the significance is that new car companies like Tesla have started with a blank sheet of paper. So, it's as if they're designing a new phone or a new laptop from scratch. And so they can dispense with a lot of the legacy, and they can get something that is basically much more like a computer, but that has some motors and a big battery attached to it. The problem with that is that if you get a Tesla, they update it from time to time, and suddenly you find that its handling characteristics change and the user interface changes, and it can be confusing. So, we're not there yet. And then there's a whole separate story around safety of autonomous driving and so on, about which I put more in my book. So the answer is it's complex, and you have to get to understand how a particular industry is doing stuff.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So Professor Anderson, I would like to ask about a thing that you slightly touched at the beginning, the IoT devices. Like, I'm interested in as a consumer, I like it as toys. But when I see the advertisements, like the first point usually is it works with Siri, with Alexa, with Google. Yeah, so that means that people are actually forced to use them in a way that they connect it centrally through some cloud of Amazon or of Google. And however perfect, secure, non-hackable the devices are, there is still the single point, the cloud operator, who can actually operate your devices. Yeah, and if you have like electric sockets or whatever, you can easily cause a breakdown in the whole country if you can operate sufficiently many of them. Do you think that there is some way how to cope with that, other than teach people like not to accept this kind of IoT?
Well, one of the things that we geeks occasionally think about, whether as a formal exercise or over a beer, is what are the doomsday scenarios? Yeah. If the North Koreans really wanted to destroy America and didn't have enough nuclear bombs to do it, then how would you do it? And one answer might be that you trash AWS or you trash Azure, right? Because if you could trash AWS, there wouldn't be enough capacity in Azure for everybody to move their stuff there, and GCP and so on. And the three big cloud providers customize their offerings to make it very difficult for people to do multi-cloud for standard business reasons. Other things that you might worry about in terms of cloud vulnerability is that 5G networks are going to depend on the cloud to a much greater extent than 4G has, right? And so there will be attack vectors there. And you know, where is your local phone company going to entrust all its software-defined networking? Whose cloud? Will it be a national cloud sitting in Prague somewhere, or will it be just general Amazon stuff or whatever's cheapest? There's all sorts of complicated questions there. Now, as far as attacking specific services or specific devices through the cloud, yeah, it can be done, but it's a lot of work. Look, for example, at what the French and Dutch did to the EncroChat criminal communication system. This is like Signal, but for drug dealers, and it was all run off about 70 virtual servers sitting on a machine in Lille in France. So in 2018 and 2019, the French went in with a warrant and got a copy, and they basically spent over a year staring at this software, figuring out how it worked and what the vulnerabilities would be. And eventually they took the whole thing over, wiretapped everybody for 2 months and closed the thing down. So well done. But it's a lot of work. You know, and I think the only reason they were able to do that is they got hold of the development server, so they actually had access to the source code for all the systems, and they already understood the systems a bit because it was kind of an adaptation of Signal, and they'd acted against a number of such systems in the past. But you know, in theory, you can go into the cloud and understand somebody's systems. In practice, you need really skilled people and an awful lot of effort.
But I mean more like, what if Amazon becomes the evil and starts using its cloud to do something bad with the devices it can operate? Like, is there some kind of like distribution
well,
which would prevent one company to become evil or cause some harm?
There has been a whole series of European privacy law cases against the US government, against cloud service providers, against Microsoft, against the Privacy Commissioner of Ireland on this very issue, that if European people's personal data is kept with a US service firm, and thus under the control of a corporate headquarters in New York or Seattle or San Francisco, on which the FBI can serve warrants, that means that US intelligence services can get access to European personal data in circumstances where the European data subjects have got no legal redress. And you know, this has been a running sore for many years, and the legal arrangements that were used to pretend that American service firms would obey European law keep on being shot down by the European courts. So yeah, there are serious tensions there. As for whether Amazon would ever attack its customers, well, they do attack their customers. They gouge you of all the money that they can gouge you out of. It's a kind of attack, isn't it? Yeah. But that's really for DG competition to look into monopolist business practices.
Yeah.
I still have one. You talked about the machine learning and the trained models, and then also the certification. So do you have some insight how trained models in, say, cars or in basically any other device is certified for safety if we can't really interpret how they are actually working inside?
Well, yeah, there's a whole bunch of stories about difficulties that you have with safety certification with machine learning. For example, the government of Singapore requires that if you're going to certify a car for level 3 advanced driver assistance systems, then it must be such that if the car becomes confused, then it must slow down and stop in the same lane. Right, that's what the rules say. But how do you do that? Because very often when a car becomes confused, it's become confused about what lane it's in, right? Because it's going through roadworks, or somebody has painted over the old white line and put a new white line in, or it's raining and the moonlight is reflecting off the road, or something like that. So if a car becomes confused, what can it do except maybe do an emergency stop and start flashing its lights? But then the car behind runs into you. This is an insoluble problem, right? Another insoluble problem, or hard to solve problem, is how do you measure liability for autonomous driving? And the classic case here comes from Tesla. Because you see, about half of all fatal accidents on the motorway are as a result of people falling asleep at the wheel, and about a third of fatal accidents overall. So if your car has got automatic emergency braking and adaptive cruise control and automatic lane keeping, right, then this should cut the number of freeway accidents to which you're exposed by 50%, because if you fall asleep, the car's just going to slow down and stop straight ahead, okay? But what happens in practice? Well, the National Highways Transportation Safety Administration got some figures from Tesla, which purported to show that Tesla drivers who had autopilot turned on had fewer fatal accidents. And then an engineering consultancy working for one of Tesla's competitors reanalyzed the figures and found that there were actually more fatal accidents. So what's going on? You know, how come automated driver assistance systems aren't cutting fatalities? Is it because people become more risk-friendly when they think they're safer? This is what some people thought for a while. And then people dug into it and they realized that what's happening is that whenever the Tesla autopilot becomes confused, it just hands control back to the driver. So typically, if you get killed when driving a Tesla on the freeway, the Tesla itself will tell you to take over about 1 second before you die. Right? And this doesn't really work because experiments done by the US aviation safety people show that even with a professional flight crew in a commercial aircraft, it takes 8 seconds for the pilot in command to recover from an unanticipated autopilot failure. Right? I mean, this is the guy who's highly qualified, stone cold sober, sitting there in charge of the plane, supposedly has situational awareness, and the autopilot suddenly goes, wah, 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 and he grabs the throttle and he grabs the stick, and then he looks at the instruments and says, which way is up, where are we going? Yes, yes, yes. We're in flight level so-and-so and course such and such and blah, 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 blah. It's 8 seconds before he's properly in command. You cannot expect the driver of an ordinary passenger car to do better, because they may be senile, they may be drunk, they may be watching a movie, they may be doing email. Our own government is now saying that when you've got ADAS level 2, that the driver will be allowed to do email, which is simply crazy, but won't be allowed to use a phone because that distracts you. So, you know, how come you sending an email is not distracting and using a phone is distracting? This is just beyond stupidity, right? But the real thing that's going on here is liability, right? Because if I'm in command of the car when I smash into another vehicle, then that's my negligence, and it's my insurance company that pays. If Tesla is driving, that's Elon Musk's insurance company that pays. Right? So this is also a security economics thing, a dependability economics thing. If you set the incentives wrong, you will get perverse behavior. Even well-meaning engineers will be overruled by corporate lawyers. And then you have to get the regulator to push back, and the regulator has to say that you will count it as an autopilot-caused accident if the autopilot was engaged in the 20 seconds before the collision, or something like that. And if you try and bring that in from a normal regulatory agency, you will suddenly find that Elon Musk is phoning the Prime Minister and offering bribes and issuing threats and so on and so forth. And the junior civil servants in the safety agency may get crapped on from a very great height.
And this data, how the regulators got that data to reanalyze? Was it something that Tesla voluntarily published, or it was?
It was data that they had to supply to NHTSA. The references to it are in my book. I describe this in the relevant chapter of the book. Mm-hmm. So it's a well-known and documented thing, and it's a known problem that how can you just leave somebody holding the wheel when they haven't been paying attention? Mm-hmm. Volvo, to their credit, have taken the view that they're not going to go to that level of driver assistance until they're confident that they can actually slow down and stop at the side of the road. But that's difficult because where's the side of the road? I've played around a bit with such stuff, and sure, it's great having an assistance system if you're driving in slow traffic on a freeway like the M25 around London, because that saves you all the effort of stopping and starting and stopping and starting. But if you go on a country road, you can easily go off the tarmac onto the grass. Mm-hmm. And if you get complicated road features like little stud roundabouts, the car will usually be confused by that. It's really, really hard. The car industry greatly oversold the potential for fully automated operation. Now, automated operation you can do in specific places, like the London Docklands Light Railway has remotely piloted trains, for example, and in some mines they have remotely piloted trucks. But doing that on general roads around the general population, kids, dogs, drunk drivers, all that sort of thing, it's really, really hard.
Thank you.
And I'm skeptical about whether we'll ever have full automation for general purpose driving in my lifetime.
Ross, your talk made me think, and I have a question/proposal. Most of us here are technologists, and we tend to compare software to things, planes, cars, and so on. And I believe that this is wrong, because software changes much more dynamically than physical objects. And isn't it time to look into other things that we sort of can regulate better, like food, for example, or water, where lessons can be learned to push for liability and responsibility of software developers and maintainers?
Well, liability for software is a very complex thing. In general, people are going to go for whoever sold the object that caused the harm, right? So if a Mercedes goes crazy and kills you, you will sue Mr. Mercedes. And if that was due to software in a Bosch vision unit, Mercedes must then claim back from Bosch. And if that was in turn due to some software that they got from the University of Toronto, then Bosch must sue the University of Toronto or whatever, because the end user, the victim, has got no visibility into the supply chain.
Well, that is true, but we learned when I go to Tesco and I buy Cadbury's chocolate made from Oreo whatever filling, there is a way to figure out whether Oreo is responsible or Cadbury's or Tesco. And I believe that we should figure out similar ways with software.
Well, if you get bad food from Tesco, you would normally claim against Tesco. We had a scandal in Britain, 5 years ago, when lots of stuff that got sold as steak in Britain turned out to be horse meat and other things like that that had come in through Ireland from slaughterhouses in Poland, and there were all sorts of shady people buying and selling containers of slightly dodgy meat. And in the end, it had to be the supermarkets that cleared that up, because they were the place that people had bought the meat from, and which could be held publicly accountable for it. If you've got some dodgy meat dealer somewhere in Ireland, a small company nobody had ever heard of, how can you get recompense against them? If you sue them and get a judgment against them, they will just make the company bankrupt and go off.
I'm not saying it's easy, but I believe that inspirations could be found there rather than in management of liability and responsibility of physical objects.
Well, it would be great if it were easy, if it were easier to sue companies that harm us. But in many countries, it's deliberately made difficult. In the UK, for example, if you sue somebody and lose, you have to pay the other side's costs. So people will be very reluctant to sue a company like a supermarket or a bank, because if you lose, you'll get a bill of costs for hundreds of thousands of pounds and it will bankrupt you. So again, the mechanisms for redress and dispute resolution are another piece of the public policy equation. Do you set up some kind of independent body for, being an ombudsman or a referee? And in that case, how do you stop it being captured by the industry it's supposed to regulate? This is all really, really hard stuff. And we've got experience of this going wrong in a number of industries. Or rather, the lawyers and accountants who advise industry have experience on how to defeat such mechanisms again and again and again in one country after another.
Thanks.
You were talking about the prolonged life of the cars and of the tools, and about the prolonged maintenance of the software. Mm-hmm. And it's going to have some cost. It will be costly to maintain the software. So my question is, where is the cost going to project? Will it go onto the customer, or who will pay for it? And a follow-up question, do you think that a subscription-based model where you buy a product, but to use the product you need to pay some subscription for the maintenance is possible in the future?
Well, there's a number of things there. The first is that the overall cost of maintenance will probably go down because an electric car only has a few dozen moving parts rather than a few thousand. So the first people who will lose out will be all these guys who've got little garages all around the world. Most of them won't be needed, okay? It will be a long, slow decline because there will still be internal combustion engine cars for many years, but over time, the amount of work for mechanics will go down. Over time, the amount of work for software maintenance people will go up. And on current patterns, you would expect many of these jobs to end up in places like India. Many of the companies that do this software already have large campuses in India because they can employ engineers for 10,000 euros a year rather than having to pay 80,000 or 100,000 euros a year here in Europe. And to the extent that stuff is still done in Europe, you may find that the work is moving away from places like Denmark and France and Germany to places like Romania, where the wages are somewhere between German wages and Indian wages. Okay, so there's going to be a shift rather than an abrupt change. As far as the subscription model is concerned, the car makers already want to sell their cars on subscription. If you walk into a Mercedes dealer and try and buy a car for cash, they will give you a hard time. They say, no, but you must have finance. I don't want finance. I've got money. No, but it will give you 0% finance, blah, 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 blah. And they will lie and lie and lie and lie and lie. Because the way the deals are structured, they make more commission out of finance than from selling the car. Right? Because once they've sold you the finance, they sell you this add-on, and they sell you that add-on, and they sell you the next add-on. So yeah, the industry talks about subscription sales. I say they must go jump in the river. If you can buy a car for cash, you should pay cash because it's cheaper. Right? And if I've bought a car for cash, I expect the people who made it to make the software updates available for free for a period of time prescribed by law. I don't expect to be dunned into saying, well, we must promote you from the bronze service thing to the silver service thing to the gold service thing, because otherwise it's going to be a hassle, right? Whenever I open the app to open my car, there'll be some big button saying, upgrade to premium, flash, 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 flash. And I won't be able to open my car until I press it. Or I press it once by mistake and I'll never be able to undo it, right? I don't want anything to do with these scams. Right, so when people talk to me about selling me stuff on subscription, I translate that mentally as, scams. If I buy a car for 2,000 or 20,000 euros, I want to actually get a car.
I agree with you on that, but my question is, even though I personally oppose this as well, do you think it is possible that this model can be can be put into motion, that the car makers can make this model happen.
Sorry, I didn't catch you.
If the car makers can make this subscription-based model happen, if they can put it into the motion.
Well, Mercedes would love to scrap all cars after 6 years. They sell you either a new car or an approved used car. But if you scrap all cars after 6 years, that means that you double the number of cars that have to be sold. So you double the environmental costs of melting all that steel, of making all that plastic, of tanning all that leather, right? You greatly increase the amount of gas that has to be bought from Russia. You greatly increase the number of cattle that have to be bred in Brazil in order to provide the leather for the seats. You greatly increase the demand for all the chips that go into the car. Environmentally, it's a catastrophe. Sorry. The car makers would love it, but the policymaker, if they're at all sensible, will hate it. The policymaker will say, Mr. Mercedes, you will maintain your software for 20 years or you will go to jail. That's the right approach, and that's basically the approach that Brussels is taking.
Thank you for the answer.
Thank you.